How we doing? Brick Aramella, the Drone Pilot Pro here, and today I'm going to compare the Mavic Air 2 and the Mavic 2 Pro at 60 frames per second. I'm also going to give you a lot of great tips to use at 60 frames per second, so let's get right into it. Alright, so both of these drones shoot 60 frames per second. The Mavic Air 2 does it in 4K, whereas the Mavic 2 Pro does it at 2.7K. But let's first start out by talking about whether you need 60 frames per second or not. For most people in most shooting situations with a drone, you're not going to need 60 frames per second. I usually shoot at 24 frames per second. If you want to slow it down ever so slightly, you could shoot at 30 frames per second, but I like the 24 frames per second look with both of these drones. So both of these drones have a 3-axis gimbal, so your footage is going to be nice and smooth and cinematic, and because you're so far away from your subject, you don't really need to slow it down because the footage is already appearing very slow because you're so far away. Now there's different situations where you need to shoot 60 frames per second, and we're going to talk about that. So when do you need 60 frames per second? Now the first reason is if you're shooting sports or cars or doing a car chase and trying to speed up or slow down the footage, anything that's moving really fast and you're close to that action, you want to use 60 frames per second because then you can slow it down in post-production, or you can speed it up if you want. If you want to make a cool transition from one scene to another where things are moving really fast and you want to slow them down and then all of a sudden you want to speed it up, you can shoot at 60 frames per second. This leads me to my second situation where something's really close to you. So it doesn't have to necessarily be sports or a car chase, but if anything is moving or you're shooting anything really close, for instance, if you're shooting inside or you're shooting a building and you're going by it or moving past it, 60 frames per second can slow things down. Whereas if you move at normal speed, it might be too fast for the viewer and they really can't take in the scene the way you want them to be. So anytime you're shooting really close to something, you might consider using 60 frames per second. All right, the next situation is if you're shooting waterfalls or water moving really fast, okay? Because it's hard for the person to take in all that fast moving water. It looks fine, but when you slow it down, it just has a more cinematic and pleasing look to the person. Now it has to fit the music or what you're talking about. Now I realize for certain videos this won't work, or certain films you're making it won't work, but from my experience and the way I shoot, I really do like slowing down water, especially if I'm close to it, especially with a waterfall. Because it's moving so fast, it's nice to shoot 60 frames per second. Now that water's just moving slow, you don't need the 60 frames per second, but in a lot of situations, rivers, waterfalls, things like this, use 60 frames per second. And the fourth situation for using 60 frames per second is doing some creative edits and speeding up and slowing down your footage. I know I talked about this earlier with sports and car chases, but you can use this in nature and all different sorts of scenes. You can add this in to make your footage more interesting, more intriguing. It's also great for transitions or intros to videos. So doing these creative edits, make sure you shoot at 60 frames per second. That way you can edit, you can speed it up or slow it down or do all sorts of things in post-production. If you only shoot at 24 or 30 frames per second and then try to speed it up or slow it down in post-production, the footage won't look smooth. You're not going to have enough frames to really slow it down or speed it up the way you want. So make sure you shoot at least 60 frames per second. That way you have more leniency in post-production when doing these creative edits. Alright, so now let's talk about the settings I used. I shot at 60 frames per second, obviously with both of these drones. The Mavic Air 2 does it at 4K, whereas the Mavic 2 Pro does it at 2.7K. However, I still think the Mavic 2 Pro looks a little better than the Mavic Air 2, and I'll explain in a second. But I just upscaled the footage, the 2.7K footage in Premiere Pro when editing, and it looks great scaled up to 4K. Side by side, I still think the Mavic 2 Pro looks better, but you can be the judge in the video that I'm about to show you. Now the other settings I used the ISO 100. Obviously keep that down so we don't have any noise or grain in our image. I also use an auto white balance and kept my f-stop number, my aperture, to f2.8 with the Mavic Air 2 because we can't change that. It's a fixed aperture. whereas the Mavic 2 Pro, you can change the aperture. Now this is best I've found between f4 to f5.6. So I used about an f4 for the majority of this footage, and I had to use an ND filter in order to get the proper exposure while using the proper shutter speed. So I used 60 frames per second, which means I had to double my shutter speed, which my shutter speed was 1/120th of a second. That way the footage looked nice and smooth and cinematic. And I recommend you use an ND filter if you're shooting during the day. During sunset or sunrise, you may not need that ND filter because you have the higher shutter speed shooting at 60 frames per second. But I'll let you be the judge, depends when you shoot. So the last settings I used, I both shot in normal mode, but I also shot in D-Cine-like with the Mavic Air 2, and then I color graded it as well with the Mavic 2 Pro. I shot in D-Log, which is kind of like the D-Cine-like. They're kind of comparable, a little more muted, desaturated tones. So you get a little more dynamic range, and you can edit that in post. So I edited that in post, did a little color grading to try to make them close together, as you can see in the comparison coming up. Now I use a 24 frame per second timeline in Premiere Pro. You can use that with whatever editing software you use. Now the reason I did that is because it looks nice and cinematic, but I had to slow down that footage. So I'm gonna show you how I slowed down that footage in Premiere Pro. Now keep in mind this will work for whatever editing software you use. And the whole point of slowing it down in post-production is to make it nice and silky and smooth and slow. Okay, so if you really want to slow it down, this is how you do it. So let me show you now. All right, so the first thing we're going to do is you're going to click on both of our clips so they're highlighted. Then you're going to right click and choose speed and duration. Then you're going to go to time interpolation and make sure it says optical flow. The reason you want optical flow is because you don't want any jittery or jumpy footage. Optical flow is going to help smooth it out after you slow it down. And then we're going to go up top to where it says speed. And since we have a 60 frame per second clip and a 24 frame per second timeline, what we need to do is slow the speed down to 40%. Then we're going to press OK. And as you can see, the clips both got longer because we slowed them down. And the footage is now going to be silky and smooth. And of course, it's going to be a lot slower now as well. And that's how we slow down our 60 frame per second slow motion video in our 24 frame per second timeline. I did this in Premiere Pro, but it will work in other editing softwares the same way. Just slow it down to 40% and make sure you choose optical flow. All right, so now we got all our settings. So that's how I shot with these drones. So we're gonna look at this first footage. Now this first footage, I shot from really far away. I probably could have used 24 frames per second or 30 frames. So this footage sort of emphasizes my point that you don't need 60 frames per second when far away, and you're gonna see it in the footage coming up. However, the thing to look in this first comparison is the video quality. And I think the Mavic 2 Pro just looked better because it has the bigger sensor, and there's too much sharpening on the Mavic Air 2. Especially you'll notice in the water, in the ripples of the water, I see some aliasing and moire. You can be the judge, but for me, it looked a little too sharpened, whereas the Mavic 2 Pro just looked a lot more natural. Even with the trees, the Mavic 2 Pro looked more natural, and I could also sharpen it a little more. I didn't, but you could sharpen that in post-production if you want, whereas the Mavic Air 2, you can't add any sharpening in post-production. And so let's get into the footage so we can see them side by side. All right, so now that we saw that footage really far away, let's get closer to that water and actually change locations. I went to a river where the water was moving a lot faster, and I shot a lot closer, got right down there, and then I also shot from above. So you'll see the difference. When I got really close to that water and shot at 60 frames per second and slow it down in post, as you're gonna see all this footage is slowed down, it's gonna look great because it's gonna look nice and cinematic and smooth. And shooting something like a dam or a waterfall, that water's moving so fast, so the 60 frames per second slowed down, it's still gonna move fast, but a lot slower than it would, and it looks nice, cinematic, and pleasing for the viewer. Whereas I've shot that at 24 frames per second, it'd be hard to take in all the different things, the water moving, the rocks, the trees, the bushes, different things. It's hard to take that in when you're really close to it. So let's go look at that footage right now. All right, I hope you enjoyed this video and found some of these tips helpful. Which did you think was better? Leave it in the comment below, the Mavic Air 2 or the Mavic 2 Pro for shooting at 60 frames per second. Also, just want to let you guys know, I sort of rebranded and changed the channel, so now I'm going by the Drone Pilot Pro. I, however, started a second channel under my name, Brett Garamella. So you can click in the description below if you want to subscribe to that channel. I'm going to start it up very soon. And in that channel, I'm going to be working on portrait photography and shooting documentaries, two things I've been doing for a long, long time. And I wanted to separate that from my drone stuff. So this channel is all about drones. So the other channel is more about photography and shooting people. So if that's interesting to you, I do appreciate the support. I'm trying to get my subscribers up because I obviously just started. I don't have any subscribers yet. The link is in the description below. But if you're only interested in drones, I do understand. Before you go, I do have my free drone gear guide. You can get that by clicking right over there. I'm Brett Garamella, the Drone Pilot Pro. And remember, fly like a pro.